Peter B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, April 11th, 2017. We've been busy at the Secret Studio today, and I've got two very powerful interviews that I'm posting for subscribers today. One is with Roger Schuler, the intrepid journalist from Alabama who broke the story that led to yesterday's resignation of Alabama Governor Robert Bentley. And the other big story that we're covering today is my exclusive interview with Dennis Kucinich, the former Ohio congressman, Democratic candidate for president twice, 2004, 2008. And Dennis Kucinich is not afraid to talk tough about demanding the truth before we take tough action. And I am referring to the incident a week ago in Syria, where it is alleged by Western intelligence that the Assad government was responsible for a chemical incident that killed over 70 people. And Dennis Kucinich does not mince words. Here's an excerpt from my exclusive interview with the former congressman.
Well, since it's not based on any evidence, and it was a rush to judgment, it bespeaks an agenda. There's an agenda here for regime change. It has nothing to do with whether chemical weapons were used or not, but has everything to do with a continuation of this incredibly flawed policy of regime change in the region, which brought us a disaster in Iraq, a disaster in Libya, is working on a disaster in Syria. It's not in the interest of the American people, nor of the whole region and the world. But this is what we're left with. And the chances of that attack being what's known as a false flag, that it could have come from rebels or ISIS, Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, are even better than that it could have come from the government. My belief is that Donald Trump doesn't have the political experience to really understand the forces inside the Pentagon, the State Department, and the CIA who try to manipulate leaders in order to bring about policies that are based in ideology or are based in personal grudges or are based in trying to help certain corporate interests. So the president at this moment probably doesn't have a clue as to what's going on, except he saw pictures of babies who were killed, and that moved him emotionally. Well, that's important that we have leaders who have that kind of capacity where they will respond to human suffering.
Dennis, I call bullshit. You're being far too generous to Trump. This is the guy who didn't bat an eye when his commando raid in Yemen that was decided over a White House dinner led to the deaths of innocent civilians, including an American, the daughter of Anwar al-Awlaki. And this is the guy who won't let a single Syrian woman or child refugee in the country. This is a guy who responded with 59 Tomahawks, and 4 children were killed at the air base that he chose to strike.
Well, wait, you cut me off, so let me finish.
I'm sorry.
Would that he have had the same sympathy and sensitivity to the over 1,000 people who were killed by U.S. airstrikes in the past month that have occurred on his watch? The people, the Yemenis who were whose boat was attacked and dozens of people were killed in a attack by a Apache helicopter that was owned by the Saudis, something we sold them. So the emotional coloration that the White House puts on this needs also to be informed by facts. And how much better would it have been, instead of striking Syria, to push for an international inquiry. And the fact that that wasn't done, Peter, leads me to believe that, again, this was an agenda. It had nothing to do with what happened on the ground.
Powerful comments from Dennis Kucinich, one of the few courageous voices willing to challenge the consensus in the Beltway, the groupthink that has infected both parties. And Dennis Kucinich goes on. When I ask him about the Democrats who've attacked Tulsi Gabbard, the congresswoman from Hawaii, who expressed her own skepticism and demanded facts and an investigation, the attacks came from former DNC chair Howard Dean, whom Kucinich calls a friend, and he's distressed that Dean would do this. And when I mentioned the attacks by Neera Tanden, the president of the Center for American Progress, the alleged liberal think tank, he said, well, the think tank has become a stink tank because it is partially fueled by Turkish money. So Dennis Kucinich has a lot to say. We also talk about the Trump-Russia investigation, and he has similar views to mine. I think you'll find it a very rewarding interview. It's available for subscribers today at peterbcollins.com, at iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spreaker, most of our outlets except for YouTube. Only this daily news and comment podcast is distributed on YouTube. The in-depth interviews you'll find starting at peterbcollins.com. So with this in mind, Rexon Tillerson, the former oil executive turned Trump Secretary of State, is on his way to Moscow. He was in Lucca, a beautiful town in Italy, for a meeting of G7, that's foreign ministers of a group of countries. And he's offered some pretty strong statements, but when you boil it down, he is going to Moscow as Trump's Secretary of State, essentially embracing Obama's policy on Syria, that we are going to talk Assad out of office. And just keep saying he's got to go, he's going to go, it's just a matter of time. While we pretend that we can take out the Islamic State and other insurgents, remove Assad, or allow him to be forced out, and that Syria will not become a failed state. So we have a Secretary of State who's never been a diplomat, never served in government. He's only cut deals with friendly countries who wanted to sell him their oil. And despite his friendship with Putin and winning the Friend of Russia award or whatever that trophy is, Tillerson's in a very tough spot. And as he left Italy, Tillerson said that Assad could no longer remain in office. Steps are underway for an international effort to remove him. Now, Obama talked that way, too, without ever specifying exactly the path for easing out or forcing out Bashar al-Assad from power in Damascus. So there's a great deal of confusion. This is not constructive ambiguity. This is not Donald Trump being unpredictable. This is a group of people who don't know what they're doing, and they're not all on the same page. So this is going to be an interesting exercise as Rex goes back to Moscow, and we'll see what he returns with. But Trump himself has not attempted to clarify this. He's tweeting at China today, not at Syria, and we'll get to his silly tweets in a little bit here. Tillerson has said just yesterday that the American priority in Syria and Iraq remains the defeat of ISIS, and that Assad does not have a place in Syria's future. Quote, I think it's clear to all of us that the reign of the Assad family is coming to an end, but the question of how that ends and the transition itself could be very important in our view to the durability, the stability inside a unified Syria. We are not presupposing how that occurs. Well, again, this is cover for ignorance and ineptitude. And, as I mentioned, Dennis Kucinich was equally critical of Democrats for their support of war and neocon regime change. And in today's New York Times, an op-ed written by Hillary's hawks, Michael Morrell, who we think would have become head of the CIA, and Evelyn Farkas, who was over at the Pentagon, likely to be a big player in a Hillary Clinton administration. And they go through a list here of issues that you should be aware of and moves that Russia has made since Trump was elected. And they do raise some interesting concerns. But then they tie that together with, of course, the claim that Russia interfered with the election and helped defeat Hillary. And they demand unspecified action. After this laundry list, they note that there have been strong words from the Vice President, the Defense Secretary, the Ambassador to the UN, but so far, quote, there has been no condemnation from Mr. Trump and, most important, no action. Then they issue instructions. The signaling needs to start with the President. He must deliver a speech asserting American interest in transatlantic security and speak resolutely on the right of states to choose democracy, a free market economy, and membership in NATO or the European Union. Now that is coded language about Ukraine, trying to force Ukraine into the European and NATO orbit, which is the reason, in my view, that Putin grabbed Crimea. He was not going to allow the only deep-water port that Russia has to be taken and moved into Ukraine's pro-American, pro-European, pro-NATO. I think orbit is the best way to describe it. So this is a real revealing moment where the neocons are showing their colors. And I hope you're paying attention, and I hope you're following the incredibly good work that Robert Perry and his colleagues are doing at consortiumnews.com. And in his latest analytical piece, Perry himself takes on the Lord of the Neocons, another guy named Robert Kagan. And he picks up on a column that Kagan wrote for the Washington Post this past Sunday. And he quotes Kagan, Thursday's action needs to be just the opening salvo in a broader campaign, not only to protect the Syrian people from the brutality of the Assad regime, but also to reverse the downward spiral of U.S. power and influence in the Middle East and throughout the world. Now, keep in mind, this guy was at the Project for a New American Century, an architect of the invasion of Iraq on the same kind of flimsy claims that we're seeing as the pretext to take action, military action, against Syria today. And Kagan made a huge miscalculation about Iraq. And he is counseling that we take his advice in the same vein, nevertheless. He went on to say, Kagan did, Trump was not wrong to blame the dire situation in Syria on Obama. The world would be a different place today if Obama had carried out his threat to attack Syria back in 2013. The bad agreement that Secretary of State John Kerry struck with Russia not only failed to get rid of Syria's stock of chemical weapons, we don't really know that, and allowed the Assad regime to drop barrel bombs and employ widespread torture against civilians, it also invited a full-scale Russian intervention. And I don't think that's actually the case. I don't think it invited it. I think that Russia seized the vacuum there. Once again, he refers to the Ghouta attack in 2013, and Bob Perry corrects him in parentheses. The evidence has indicated the attack was likely a provocation by al-Qaeda's Syrian affiliate with help from Turkish intelligence. So this is a really excellent takedown by Bob Perry of Bob Kagan. I've linked to it in the show file for this podcast, and I strongly urge you to read it. There's also a powerful letter to President Trump from 24 former U.S. intelligence officials, the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. And they wrote similar memoranda to Barack Obama. I don't think he ever acknowledged or honored their advice. But let me read a couple of lines here. We write, Mr. President, to give you an unambiguous warning of the threat of armed hostilities with Russia, with the risk of escalation to nuclear war. The threat has grown after the cruise missile attack on Syria in retaliation for what you claimed was a chemical weapons attack on April 4. Our U.S. Army contacts in the area have told us this is not what happened. There was no Syrian chemical weapons attack. Instead, a Syrian aircraft bombed an al-Qaeda in Syria ammunition depot that turned out to be full of noxious chemicals, and a strong wind blew the chemical-laden cloud over a nearby village where many consequently died. Now, that's what Russia and the Syrians have been saying, but you can't believe them ever, right? Anything they say, the opposite must be true. Now, this is me being argumentative. I'm no longer quoting from the letter to Trump. We believe that it's of transcendent importance to prevent relations with Russia from falling into a state of complete disrepair. And it's signed by people I know. Bill Binney, former technical director of the NSA, Tom Drake, former NSA analyst, senior executive there, Phil Giraldi, operations officer retired, former senator, and military intelligence officer Mike Gravel. Let's see, John Kiriakou, Linda Lewis, she's a listener and subscriber to this podcast. Thanks, Linda. Ray McGovern, Colleen Rowley, Scott Ritter, Peter Van Buren, Kirk Wiebe, Ann Wright. Those are just some of the people who signed on to this letter to Trump. Meanwhile, the Donald says that he's going to squeeze China to squeeze North Korea by dangling incentives in a trade deal that really hasn't been fashioned. And this diplomacy was launched in a series of tweets this morning. And they were pretty late, 8 o'clock Eastern time. He'd already had his brekkie, I guess. First tweet was kind of nice. I explained to the president of China that a trade deal with the U.S. will be far better for them if they solve the North Korea problem! Exclamation point. The next tweet was a little bit more pointed. North Korea is looking for trouble. If China decides to help, that would be great. If not, we will solve the problem without them. Now, that's a very risky threat for Trump to make. He's already sent a Navy carrier strike group into the waters off the Korean peninsula. What are they going to do, catch the next errant missiles from Kim Jong-un's test facilities? No, they're rattling sabers. And with an unpredictable, some might say, off-kilter Kim Jong-un, this could be a provocation that leads to an attack on South Korea. Not necessarily nuclear, but one that could inflict serious civilian and perhaps military casualties. And Trump seems to believe that he can bully and bluff his way past this. And after all, Kim Jong-un is an idiot, fat boy, 30 years old, and a ruthless dictator with, he claims, some crude nuclear weapons and missiles that he's trying to perfect to carry those nuclear weapons. And even the New York Times adds the threat by Trump to act unilaterally is not new, but a military attack would be far more complex and a risky undertaking than the strike on Syria, given the North's nuclear ability, missile arsenal, and its proximity to huge population centers in South Korea. I think I just said that using different words. Meanwhile, new information on the whatever war in Afghanistan that lurches into its 16th year. Now, once again, the United States has ponied up big money, $100 million, to rebuild the Afghan military. We routed out the corrupt leaders of the last gang. We recruited new soldiers. We gave them fresh uniforms and ammunition and guns and everything they could want. And they proceeded to lose more territory in recent months than we have seen in years, particularly in Helmand province in the south, where the militants control 7 of 14 districts and are in contest on 5 more. That means only 2 are solidly held by the Kabul government. And this is an indication of the folly of America's continued presence in the graveyard of empires. And Mike Morrell, in his litany of attacks on Russia, claims that Russia is now supporting the Taliban in Afghanistan, which would be poetic payback for the U.S. support for the Mujahideen against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in the 1980s. At the top of the podcast, I mentioned that I also conducted an in-depth interview today with Roger Schuler, the journalist and blogger who has covered the corruption in Alabama for years. And it was in August of 2015 that Roger Schuler first reported that Governor Bentley, who just resigned yesterday, was having a sexual affair with a staffer named Rebecca Mason. It's all proven to be true. And facing impeachment, Bentley stepped down yesterday. Now, Roger Schuler is not ready to disclose his sources. But in our exclusive interview, he explained to me that this was one of the easiest stories he ever covered because the news came to him.
But, yeah, I mean, there's just so much irony in all of this. And these people, it's like they eat hypocrisy for breakfast. It just is everywhere you turn. And of course, you know, he was married. He and his wife have been married for 50 years. And that's how the whole story started, was that she filed for divorce. And the funny thing is, I've got to be truthful here. I talk about breaking the story like it was some sort of, great piece of shoe leather journalism on my part. The minute her divorce story came out, I had people calling me. I was just sitting at our table here in Missouri, was where we were by then, and people I knew who were very, very knowledgeable on politics were just calling me. All I had to do was just sit there and listen. These were people like, I'm sure you have these kinds of sources that you just know that they know what they're talking about. Yeah. And it all added up. And so the story came to me almost more than the other way around. And was it
like fishing at a trout farm, Roger?
Exactly. I put my little worm on a hook, and next thing I know, I'm reeling them in. And
so that's Roger Schuler in a clip from our in-depth interview today. It's available for subscribers at peterbcollins.com and all of our outlets except for YouTube, as I mentioned earlier. And I've got this second clip for you from my conversation with Roger Schuler. It's very clear to me that he can exclusively claim that he was the first to report on the Bentley affair. August 31st, 2015. The first coverage in the corporate media in Alabama came the following February or March. And last night, that would be Monday, April 10th, on the Rachel Maddow Show on MSNBC, she brought on John Archibald, a reporter for AL.com and a newspaper there that publishes 3 days a week. And she gave him full credit for it, never mentioning Roger Schuler, and, of course, John Archibald didn't bother to either. And this journalistic sleight of hand, this failure to properly credit the guy who has paid a brutal price from the establishment payback in Alabama for his courageous reporting, can't even get credit for the story on a cable news channel. And on Monday night, Rachel featured reporter John Archibald and gave him full credit, saying he broke the story. He's been on it for over a year, and she repeatedly was heaping praise on him. Now, Archibald himself didn't bother to say, well, you know, actually there was a blogger who first broke this story. Hey, enjoy it.
I'm sorry, Peter. I just can't help laughing because I thought of this scenario myself.
You go ahead and laugh all you want. You deserve it, okay? You've earned it. So, you know, here is Archibald being treated like a Pulitzer Prize nominee by Rachel Maddow, and he doesn't even have the good judgment and the generosity to say, well, you know, some other people actually got the recording and broke the story, and I'm just riding on their coattails. And there's also a guy named Chuck Dean, who's also a reporter there, and unfortunately, you don't enjoy any benefit of the doubt from him because you outed him as an Ashley Madison customer.
Yeah. Chuck's been real unhappy with me for quite a while, and but I've imagined that same scenario of Archibald. And of course I knew he wouldn't do it, but somebody that would have enough intestinal fortitude and integrity to correct Rachel on the air and say, Rachel, I'm happy to tell you I have reported on it and worked on it, but I did not break it. My organization didn't break it, and for 7 months we tried to squelch it. I mean, that's really the biggest story of all. Is that I posted the article where he said, "Oh, there's barely smoke here. There's no fire. There's no facts. There's no proof." And So that's what's really galling is that he not only didn't break it, he was like 7 months behind the curve.
And was part of an effort to cover it up. He was carrying water for Bentley. That's right. And Rachel Maddow didn't manage to know that. I understand. She's not in Alabama. She hasn't covered these issues with help of a guy like Roger Schuler, like I have. But it's unforgivable that Archibald would sit there and take all those plaudits, take credit, and never mention Roger Schuler's critical role. And in the in-depth interview, the show file for that podcast, you'll find links to various reports from Roger Schuler and follow the sublinks of his in there to the earlier reporting he did to show exactly what we just described. And there's much more in the Schuler interview, including the corrupt deal that now U.S. Senator Luther Strange made with Bentley to succeed Jeff Sessions. And that's a troika of dirty, dirty people, in my humble opinion. So there's a lot to learn from my conversation with Roger Schuler. As always, it's made possible by people who support me with your subscriptions. People like George Reeves. Superman? I think that one is a little dated. Andrew Harnack, Susan Lundgren, and John Zweibel. They're all staunch supporters of this podcast, and I encourage you to join in. I need your help to keep this going. Come on over to peterbcollins.com. You click on the menu button, pull it down, click on Become a Subscriber. It takes you to the sign-up page, and it's as easy as PIE. A federal judge in Texas ruled that the Texas law requiring a photo ID in order to vote was intentionally discriminatory. When her case was appealed to the right-wing Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans, they said, no. They sent it back, and they demanded further forms of proof for the intention that the judge has cited. Well, Nelva Gonzalez Ramos in the U.S. District Court for the southern part of Texas. There's a song by War that I think of when I hear southern part of Texas. Anyway, she issued a new ruling, pretty much same as the old ruling, and said that while she followed the instructions of the Fifth Circuit, that the new information didn't tip the scales, she said, in favor of the state. And here's commentary from Myrna Perez at the Brennan Center for Justice. She says, this is an exciting ruling, but no surprise. Texas passed the most restrictive photo ID law in the country, a law the legislators knew would hurt minority voting rights without any evidence in justifying it, and they broke all sorts of legislative rules and norms to do it. The bills were never heard in committee. They went directly to the floor. They were labeled emergency legislation, limiting debate, and bypassing the committee process. But what's fundamental here is that the judge has ruled that the law's true purpose was to help Republicans maintain their hold on power. So it'll be interesting to see what the Fifth Circuit does as this one bounces back to them again. And what'll happen if it ultimately reaches the new, fully fleshed out Supreme Court with Neil Gorsuch, who I don't believe is any friend of minority voting rights. The Democrats have an interesting play going right now, and I give them credit for playing good defense. The Trump team has been promising the voters it pandered to some massive tax cuts, mostly for corporations and the ultra-wealthy. But Trump Co. is rethinking their tax cut package, partly because they didn't repeal Obamacare, and they needed to use that as a piggy bank to pretend that they were paying for the tax cuts they're passing. But Democrats have come up with a new gambit, and that is, well, listen, Trump wants to, for example, eliminate the alternative minimum tax. And the only tax return we've seen from 2005 shows that he benefited handsomely. That he only paid tax because of the alternative minimum. He wants to remove that completely. That would be self-dealing. And so the Democrats are saying, look, in order to analyze what kind of benefit Trump would enjoy from a tax reform or tax cut package that hits Capitol Hill, we got to see those tax returns. And they're right. And finally today, it warms my heart. I am a customer of Wells Fargo Bank, and I never chose them. I became a customer because they bought my bank, First Interstate, years ago. I also happen to own a few shares in Wells Fargo. And I am delighted that some active members of the board of directors, prodded by institutional investor representatives, have forced the former CEO and the number 2 executive who was responsible for the heavy-handed pressure sales tactics that led many Wells Fargo bankers to fraudulently open up credit card and bank accounts for customers who were completely unaware. They did it to meet very aggressive sales quotas that were imposed by John Stumpf, the former CEO, and the head of community banking, a woman named Carrie Tolstedt. And they have been ordered to cough up a combined $75 million from the compensation they received while working at Wells Fargo. This is justice. This is how corporate governance should work. This is how rogue bankers should be treated. Now, I still think that these 2 individuals should be subject to criminal prosecution, and I wouldn't be offended if that occurs. But think back to 2008. Obama, Eric Holder, what was her name, Mary Jo White at the Securities and Exchange Commission. They took money from bankers as penalties for the meltdown of the economy in 2008 and the very risky moves that those bankers were responsible for. But not a single one paid back a dime in bonuses, in compensation, in stock options, and not a single one was seriously prosecuted or went to prison. Now, this is a good first step. The Wells Fargo wagon has a couple of former executives in. They're not getting out until they pay $75 million. Thanks for joining me today. Trigger's going to ride along the Wells Fargo wagon and secure that for us. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.